All right. Well, I think we can get started, and if they join in later, we'll get them brought up to speed. So my name's Mallory. I'm the resident artist for the Allentown Art Museum for 2020, 2021. And I'm going to be leading the workshop today. I'm a mixed media fiber artist, and part of what I do is a lot of felting, which is what we're going to be learning today. We're going to be learning something called wet felting and also something called needle felting. So the wet felting is going to be the big part of our workshop, and the needle felting will be the final part. And the wet felting, just by the name, obviously includes some water. So that's why we have a towel at our workspace if you have one available. And the needle felting part is going to be a dry form of felting. So we're going to be making little felted creatures today. They can be super cute, they can be creepy, they can be cute and creepy, they can look like an animal or maybe like a holiday creature. It can, your imagination's the limit for what these little guys can look like. Mine all have like a little bit of a creepy vibe to them, but that's just my own personal style. Yours can look however you want them to look. And we're gonna go through everything step by step, and I'll be doing it along with you. So we'll all be going through the steps together. And once again, if you missed something, if you want me to repeat anything, if you want me to slow down, just give a shout or wave your hands, make a motion so that I know to take a step back, and I'll repeat any instructions that you need as many times as you need it. So I want to tell you a little bit about wet felting, what it is and why it works, so we understand what we're doing before we get into the steps of making our little creature. So if you see on the hand cam, I'm holding some wool, and you guys should have some wool in a bunch of different colors of wool in your kits. And the roving, when you unwind that ball, there's a bunch of different colors of roving, and they come in ropes that look like this, these skinny ropes. And if you kind of teased it apart, you'll see that there's all of these tiny, tiny little hairs making up the roving. Those are all hairs that was, sheep hairs. That's what wool is. And if we took a look at any one of these individual hairs under a microscope, you'd see that they have scales on them, these funny little scales that look like fish scales. And the nifty thing about these scales is that when you get them wet, which is the wet part of wet felting, the scales will actually open up. They'll kind of they'll peel out and away from the fiber itself. So imagine each one of these little woolen hairs has these microscopic little spikes on them. So that's what happens when you get them wet. We add soap to the water so that the fibers get kind of slippery and slick so that they move around each other really easily. And the soap is also doing something else. It's replacing a material called lanolin, which is naturally in sheep's wool, but it gets washed out through the processing, because no one wants to get like an oily Christmas sweater. So we wash the oil out of the wool. But in order for felting to happen, we have to replace that lanolin. So we use soap to kind of imitate that material. And then we do something called agitation, which is really just making the fibers move around each other repeatedly. So it could look a little something like this, or we're going to use our felting rollers to roll over the wool like that. That's the agitation. And what's happening is all of those little fibers that now have those microscopic spikes on them, they're kind of oiled up from the soap. As they move around each other, they're getting tangled tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter together until this loose, fluffy woolen material turns into something sturdy and sculptable. It turns into fabric. Very cool, very durable, very sculptable fabric. So that is the process of wet felting in a nutshell, and that's what we'll be doing today. Now, before I get into our very first step, I just want to make sure that everyone has all the tools and materials they need. Everyone has a towel, everyone has a container to put the soap in, and everyone has a roller that came in their felting kit, along with some wool. And there should be a styrofoam block and some needles in your kit. So just, if anyone is missing any materials, make a sound or give me a thumbs down. Seems like everyone's good. Awesome. All right, so what I want you guys to do next is unroll your rollers. There should be a pool noodle with some bubble wrap wrapped around it that's tied together with a rubber band. So I want you to unroll it, and there should be a sheet of plastic inside of there as well as a sheet of foam. The plastic sheet is going to go into your container with the soap, and it's just going to hang out there until we need it. What you need now is that sheet of foam that's inside your kit. And you're also going to need a pair of scissors and some kind of marker or something to write with, a Sharpie, a marker, a pen, anything that you can draw with on that sheet of foam. I should have mentioned that earlier, my apologies. So scissors, that piece of foam, and some kind of marker is what we're gonna need right now. So what we're doing with that material is we're gonna make a pattern piece with that material. So in order to turn our felt into a three-dimensional little creature, we're gonna need to felt around a shape. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna make the shape of our creature, whatever it is, out of that piece of foam. So if I want to, let's say I want my little monster creature to look something like this guy on the sheet. He's got these like spiky ears and two little feet. That's the shape that I'm gonna draw on to my pattern material. If I wanted to make a little monster creature that looks more like this, the shape I would draw would look like this. Kind of like a little melted Hershey kiss. So do you guys see the similarity? So what you're doing is you're kind of imagining what's the outline of the little monster creature that you're making, and you're going to draw that outline or that shape onto the foam. Now, what I want to say is that the simpler the shape is, the better for your very first time felting. I know you might want to make like a really crazy complicated shape. For your very first time felting, I would recommend something simple, maybe like this shape or that shape, or maybe something kind of like this, where he just has like two little feet at the bottom. Now, something like this, where the line curves up and into the shape, or something like that there, or that here, anytime the shape curves in, I call that an indent. And that is going to make it just a tiny bit more complicated with the felting. That's going to require an extra step that I'll go over, but I just want you to know when you draw your shape, try to limit it to one indent in your shape. You know, if you go for 2 or 3 or 4, it gets a lot more complicated, especially with the smaller pieces. So simple shapes are the best. If you want to do an indent, try to stick to one. And the other thing is you don't need to put any details on this drawing. You don't have to add eyes or hair or any kind of details, because this is just a pattern piece. All of those details are going to come in at the end of the workshop. So just a simple shape on your foam. And once you've drawn it on there, you're going to cut it out with the scissors. Okay, so that's our first set of steps. Does anyone have any questions or want me to repeat anything or go over any of those instructions again? Everyone good? All right, so get to drawing, and then once it's drawn on, cut it out. Feel free to really use the whole sheet of foam, you know, make your drawing fill up that space. Don't make it too tiny, because when we felt things, it does shrink. It will get smaller as you felt it. So really use up that whole space on the pattern foam. So that's going to be my shape. So this is an indent and that's an indent. So I have 2 on here, but I do this a lot. So if you want to do a shape something like this, I would pick only one of these indents, you know, only one of these curves to have on your piece. So now that I've drawn it on, I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm going to cut it out And after you've finished the cutting out, you don't need the marker anymore. You can put that off to the side, and you can put your foam scraps off to the side as well. So once you have your pattern piece cut out, don't rush if it's not cut out yet, that's totally fine. But once it is cut out, you can place it onto your bubble wrap, onto the smooth side of your bubble wrap. And then if you haven't already, make sure you have that soap container with a little bit of soap, and you can fill it with some hot or warm water. If you cut out your pattern piece and you're waiting for everyone to catch up, feel free to go grab some of that hot water for your soap container, and then you can have it nearby for when you need it. The other thing you can do if you're waiting, if you have your pattern piece cut out and you're waiting for the next step, you can take that ball of wool that came inside your kit that's all wound up and begin to unwind it and separate out the individual like colored ropes of roving so that you can use them for the next step. Be gentle with them because they can rip apart really easily. We'll actually be doing that in our next step, but just kind of pull them apart into their separate pieces. And think about what colors you might want to use for your felted creature. What might be your first color that you decide to use? Now that we have our pattern piece cut out, the next thing we're going to do is add the wool. So like I was saying before, that, you know, and you can clearly see from your kits, this is what the wool roving looks like. It comes in these little ropes. We can't just take this rope and kind of put it on top of our pattern piece and add the soap and water and call it a day. What we need to do is build up layers of wool that cover our whole pattern piece. And we want to take these pieces of wool that are kind of thick right now and break them down into smaller, thinner little chunks of wool. And the way that we're going to do that is by finding the end of the roving, whatever color you want to use first, and you're going to put it in the hand that you don't write with. So I write with my right hand, so my left hand is going to be the one that grabs the roving. Now, I'm holding it so that the wool is kind of coming out of the top of my hand, and it sort of looks like troll doll hair coming out of the top of my hand. You know, I don't want to grab it here where it's falling over, grabbing it right kind of at the top. So there's just a little top. Now, my other hand, the hand that I write with, is going to make this sideways thumbs up hand, where I take my 4 fingers, bring them together, and I grab, or I reach to touch the heel of my hand. What I'm doing is I'm making like a little clamp with my hand so that I can then grab just the very tippy top of the wool with that clamped hand like that. And then I gently pull my hands apart and I get a really nice thin piece of wool. So thin you can barely see it. Now, a good way to test if your wool is nice and thin is to actually put it up to your eye and see if you can see through it. If you can't see through it, it's still too thick. So once again, I'm grabbing the wool with my left hand so it looks like troll doll hair coming out of the top of my fist. I don't have a very tight grip. I'm not gripping it like this. It's just a very light hold. My other hand makes that clamp. So just the tippy top of the wool is going in between my fingers and the heel of my hand. And then I move my hands in opposite directions so that the wool just breaks apart very easily. So once you have some pieces, once you get the hang of pulling the wool apart like that, where you're just grabbing the very top and pulling, you're going to start to place it onto your pattern piece. So I'm going to take these pieces of wool, continue to pull them apart, and lay them down on top of my pattern piece. As I do that, I'm making sure that every piece slightly overlaps the one that came before it, and that they're all going in the same direction. So if you look at this guy, you can see how all of the wool fibers, they're all going lengthwise or vertical, right? So I'm going to keep covering up my pattern piece with vertical pieces of wool until the whole thing is covered. It's okay if the pieces go off the edges of your pattern piece a little bit. You actually want it to go off the edges, not by too much, just by a little bit. But you can see on mine, on the hand cam, that now my whole pattern piece is covered with one layer of wool. It's still thin though, I can still see through to the foam that's underneath, and that's a good thing. So that is layer one of our wool. How's everyone doing with those steps? Anyone need anything repeated? Anyone having trouble?
Can you mix up the colors, or should the first layer all be the same?
You can absolutely mix up the colors. If you would even like to take two colors in your hand at once, I have like brown and white together, you can actually pull them apart at the same time and have a little bit of a blend and then place them onto your pattern piece. So feel free to mix up the colors. Now, once I have one layer down that's totally covering my pattern piece, I'm gonna continue to pull the same type of pieces and I'm gonna put them on top of my first layer. Now I'm making layer number 2, but this time the pieces are gonna change direction and they're going to go sideways or horizontal. So my second layer is going the opposite direction of my first layer. So if you know what Jenga is, you can imagine that you're building a Jenga tower, but out of wool, where one layer is vertical, second layer is horizontal, and then the third layer is going to be vertical, fourth layer is horizontal, fifth layer is vertical. We're going to keep doing this until we get to 5 layers. So keep track as you're putting them down, how many layers you've done. It doesn't matter if you start with vertical or horizontal. You know, you can start with either one. The most important thing is that every time you put on a new layer, it's going the opposite direction as your first layer. As you get to your second and third layer, you might notice that you can't really see your pattern piece anymore. That's fine. Just make sure that every layer is the same size as the last one. Now, if you would like, once you get to your 5 crisscrossing layers, if you want to add something, a color that's maybe just like a stripe or in like a small section that doesn't need to be the same size as the other layers, maybe just the bottom half, maybe you just want the bottom half to be yellow, you can put on a little section of yellow that doesn't have to cover the whole thing. Once there's 5 crisscrossing layers, you can do a little, like some decorative sections. So if I want the bottom of this little guy here to just be this color gray, I can throw on just a little section of gray at the bottom that doesn't necessarily have to change directions, and it doesn't have to cover the whole piece. But that's only once you have those 5 crisscrossing layers already in place. Let's say I want to add like a blue stripe to my die. I'm gonna grab some blue. I can take just a really thin piece of blue wool and I can just lay it on top and give them a stripe, and that's totally fine. So you can get a little decorative once you have those 5 crisscrossing layers on top. You want to arrange it in a swirl. Maybe I'm going to arrange mine in a swirl. That seems fun. Okay. So on mine, I've got my 5 crisscrossing layers, and then I've got a little decorative element on top. If you decide to do something kind of decorative on top, remember to stick with thin pieces of wool. If they get too thick, it's going to be hard for it all to felt together. So still try and make your pieces spread apart and as thin as you can. Nothing too bulky. I'm going to spread some of my wool out so that it can all felt together the way I need it to. what you can do, we got another thumbs up, fantastic. So what you can do next, once you've got your 5 crisscrossing layers, maybe a little decorative element on, we're gonna find, there also, forgot to mention this before, but there should be a piece of mesh inside of your kit that came rolled up, kind of looks like tutu material. We're gonna need that as well. And that piece of mesh can be spread out flat and laid right on top of your wool. That's gonna lay right on top. It's gonna act like a little protective layer, because the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take our container that has the soap, the warm water, and that sheet of plastic in there. I'm gonna ball up my plastic sheet. So scrunch it up into a ball, and you're gonna swirl it around in that soapy water. Try and pick up as much soapy water as possible. If your water isn't making like suds, if it's not making little soapy suds, as you swirl it up, squirt a little bit more soap in there, because remember that soap is replacing the lanolin. If it's not in there, the felting doesn't work. Make sure your water is nice and soapy. And then we're gonna take this ball, this crunched up ball of plastic, move it over on top of our wool, and we're gonna squish it out into the center of our little pile of wool, really squeeze it, and then gently, really gently move the plastic over your wool so that you're spreading that soapy water out to all the edges of your piece. If you need more water, don't be afraid to dunk your little ball of plastic back in there, get a bit more soapy water on there, and squeeze, squeeze, and then gently scrub. If you're too rough with the scrubbing step, if you start going like that with a lot of pressure, you might mess up your pattern. You're gonna mess up the layering of the wool. So be very gentle as you're moving the water and the soap out over your piece. Now, as you scrub, what should start to happen is your piece should start to look flat. It was nice and light and fluffy before. Once you squeeze that soapy water into it, it should look flat to the mat. If there's any spot that still looks kind of lumpy or puffy or bubbly, or if you go to poke it and it kind of bounces back, that means that there's still dry wool under there. So you're gonna wanna take some more of that soapy water and reapply and swish it into that spot. Anything that looks dry or fluffy or bouncy. Now, once your piece is scrubbed, totally flat to the mat, no dry spots are left, you're gonna peel that screen off and put it off to the side. We will need it later, so make sure you keep track of where that ends up. How's everyone doing with that scrubbing step? Doing good? Good? Awesome. So imagine now that all the wool's wet, imagine all those little microscopic scales, they've opened up and they're ready to attach to their neighbors, right? So the next thing you're gonna do, once the screen has been peeled off, everything's wet and soapy, you're going to grab that pool noodle that was inside your kit, and you're gonna put it at the end of the bubble wrap and start to wrap the bubble wrap around your noodle and continue to roll it up until it rolls up right over the wool. You can see my wool has disappeared. It's rolled inside the bubble wrap, and I'm gonna put a little bit of pressure, use my hands to put a little bit of pressure on the roller, and then I'm gonna roll back and forth just like this for 2 minutes. We're only gonna do this part for 2 minutes. So if you wanna set a timer, count to 60 twice, count to 120, whatever it is, just make sure that when you roll, you're counting, that you're only doing 2 minutes, and that you're putting some pressure. If you don't put much pressure on it, if you're just kind of like pushing it with no weight, not much agitation is gonna happen, not much felting or tangling can start to happen. So just a little bit of pressure and roll. If you'd like, you can also tie your kit back up with the rubber band, and that can help keep everything together as you roll back and forth. So when your 2 minutes are up, you can unroll your kit, undo the rubber band if it's rubber banded, unroll it. Your piece should look pretty sudsy now. You've kind of like lathered up all the soap that's in there. And what we're gonna do next is we're gonna flip the piece over. So is everybody ready to see the next step? Get a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Oh, I see a thumbs down. All right, we're not quite ready yet. I see one thumbs up. All right, so just make sure if your camera's off and you're not ready, make sure you make a sound or wave at me to be like, no, don't go yet. But I'm gonna wait. We have some friends who are still rolling. So the rolling action that we're doing right now is a really good way to get your piece to be felted. There's actually, there are nomads who live in Mongolia who felt their homes. So they live inside yurts, and they actually make the felt that makes the yurt. And the way that they do it is they have a roller, kind of like we have a roller, but it's not bubble wrap, it's canvas. And they wrap it up and they tie it to a mule, and they have that mule just walk around a field for like 8 hours. And as the mule walks, the roller turns, and the wool and the water and the lanolin that's naturally in the wool from their flocks of sheep, because they don't wash it out, all in place. And as the mule walks, the roller turns, and when they're all done, they have these really intensely thick, well felted pieces of felt that they cover their homes with. And the felt is waterproof because the lanolin's still in there, and that oil creates a waterproof coating, and it's flame retardant because wool is flame retardant, and it's insulating, which means it's warm. It really holds the heat. So it makes it makes a home. So we're doing this on a very small scale. Imagine having so much wool and doing so much felting that you make a house. Can you imagine how much wool that would take? It's crazy. So are we all ready for that next step? Everyone good? Awesome. Okay. So what we're going to do next is you're going to gently pick up the wool by taking an edge and kind of peeling it back, peeling it up. And at the same time, grab your pattern piece that's underneath. So you're picking them both up at once. And then you're going to flip it over like a pancake, so that you now see your pattern piece on top of the wool. Now, if in the process of rolling, your pattern piece has shifted, maybe your pattern piece has moved off to the side and it looks something like that on the hand cam, you're going to want to just pick that pattern piece up and shift it over and make it as centered as you possibly can, so that there's even wool all around your pattern piece. So now that we've flipped it, you can see you have this excess, you have this extra wet wool that's hanging off the edge of your pattern piece. What we're going to do with this material is we're going to actually take it and fold it over the edges of our pattern piece. But before you do that, we don't want to, fold one side and fold the other side and fold in the bottom like you're wrapping a present. What we're going to do is you're going to pick one spot to start in. So I'm going to pick right here, and you're going to pull it over the edge of your pattern piece, and then go to a spot right next to it and pull it over, so that you make these like tiny little pleats that start to wrap around the edges of your pattern piece. So you don't want any really big thick folds in the corner. You want to do something that's called distributing the ease, which means you make lots of tiny folds instead of one big fold. Now, if you have an indent in your pattern piece, the way I do, I've got two very big indents. Well, let's do the little one first. So you can see on the hand cam, the little indent where the legs are. In order for my wool to fold around that curve, I need to do a little bit of cutting. So I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to clip I'm gonna make one cut right to the center of that curve in the wool. I'm gonna stop when I get to my pattern piece. So I've just made one cut in the center. Now I'm gonna make 2 more cuts on either side of that center line on a diagonal like this. So I'm kind of cutting these little triangular tabs out of the wool. So now I've got this little triangle, and I've got another little triangle, and I'm going to then be able to fold that around my curve. Because now I've released the fabric. I've allowed it to open up so it can curve, it can take on that curve. And then I'm going to continue to fold around the other side of my pattern piece by making lots of tiny little pleats all around the outer edge. And then I have my nice big curve at the top that I once again am going to need to do a cut right down the middle, and then a diagonal cut on either side. So it can fold over the top. When you're finished with the folding steps, you should have your pattern piece. There should be no wool hanging off the sides anymore. It should all be wrapped around the edges of your pattern piece. You should see your shape come through, and you should be able to see some of your pattern foam still visible on this new side. All right, so the good news about the next steps is that we've already done all of them. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna repeat all the steps from the beginning when we were putting on those 5 crisscrossing layers of wool, to that decorative layer, to putting the mesh on top, adding the soap and water, pulling the mesh off, rolling for 2 minutes, flipping it over, and wrapping that excess wool around the other side. So everything that we did after we made our pattern piece, we're repeating those next steps now. So we're basically making the other side of our felted toy. So I'm going to begin by placing my first layer of wool on top of my pattern piece. This can be a whole new set of colors and mixtures. It could match the other side. It could be totally different. You know, don't feel like you have to, if you want it to kind of look cohesive all the way around, maybe you want your toy to have 2 different faces. Maybe one side is naughty and one side is nice, or one side is mischievous and one side is an angel. Who knows? You know, you could make them totally different sides and totally different colors if you want. But we're going to do the same thing where we take our pieces of wool, pull them apart real nice and thin, and overlap them when they lay down on top of our pattern piece. And again, make sure that there's still some wool hanging off the edges, because you want there to be enough material so that you can wrap the excess wool around the other side. If you had a lot of excess last time, you know, maybe you went a little too far off the edges of your pattern piece, or your pieces may have been a little bit thicker. So remember to check every time you pull a piece apart. I have this piece of wool, hold it up to your eye and check if you can see through it. If you can't see through it, it's a little too thick. And if you have a piece that's too thick, what you can actually do with it is kind of tease it apart by putting it in between your 2 hands and like really just gently pulling the edges away from each other, like I'm doing right now in the hand cam, to really thin it out. Like that. So now you have a nice thin piece that you can see through if you're having trouble with the step where you're pulling the wool apart. If you're wondering why we pull it apart so it can be so thin, why it's so necessary for the wool to be nice and thin like that, it's because, you know, all the layers that we're putting on, all these 5 crisscrossing layers, they need to tangle all together to make a nice, smooth, cohesive piece of felt. So all the wool fibers from the bottom need to tangle with the wool fibers that's on top of them, and the layer that's on top of that, and the layer that's on top of that. And if one of your layers or, you know, a couple pieces are too thick and too kind of crunched together, then it's going to be really hard for the wool, for all those little individual fibers that may be stuck inside the thickness of this little rope of roving. It's going to be really hard for them to tangle on to the layers that are above and below them. So you want to make sure that there's some air, there's some space in between the fibers that you're laying down onto your mat and onto your creature pattern piece. Otherwise, you're going to have a trickier time felting. It might take you a little bit more time. It might not come together the way you want it to. So you really want to make sure that there's some air and some space between the little fibers. And remember, we're doing 5 crisscrossing layers. And then if you want to do another little decorative element on this side as well, you can do little decorative elements, but only after you have those 5 crisscrossing layers. So I'm going to keep talking through the next steps as I go through them, just to kind of remind everybody what comes after each step. Don't feel like pressured if you're not at the step that I'm voicing on camera. Just keep going at your own pace. And again, if you need me to repeat something or re-demonstrate something, just give a shout or a wave. So once those 5 crisscrossing layers are on, you've got your, maybe like your little decorative element on top. Maybe it's a stripe, maybe it's just a mix of colors. You can also do something really fun with the wool that I forgot to mention before, where you take a piece and you kind of tease it apart, fold it over itself and tease it apart and open it up, and it becomes this sort of like nebulous cloud of wool that when you place it on top of your piece, when we start to felt it, it'll get integrated and felted into place and look like this beautiful kind of like spider webby element of color that mixes into your piece. So you can do a little bit of experimentation with that if you'd like. So once all your wool is in place, you're going to grab that screen from before, that piece of mesh. You're going to lay it on top, and we're going to reapply our soapy water just as before, where we swirl our plastic around in the warm soapy water. If your water's cooled off, that's fine. It's not gonna not work if the water isn't warm or hot, but it feels better on your hands, I think, when it's warm, and it can help the felting go a little quicker. So the hot water is a nice way to kind of speed up the felting process. So if you're ever maybe in a felting rush, or you need something to get felted really, really quickly, a good way to do that is to run it under really, really, really hot water and be kind of agitating it while it gets soaked by that hot water. You may have experienced felting at some point in your life accidentally. If you ever put an item of wool clothing in the washing machine and you added soap and water, and the water was hot, and then that washing machine spun it around and agitated it, you may have ended up with an item of clothing that has shrunken to doll size. And that's because all of the wool fibers felted together in that washing machine. Once you've scrubbed your piece, everything's saturated, nothing's fluffy. Remember to peel that screen off. And then we're gonna do those 2 minutes of rolling. At this point, if you you know, if you want, you can also adjust some of the wool that's on your mat. So some of my blue looked a little bit thick and I want to spread it out. So I'm going to pinch it and kind of pull it off to the side and spread it out so that it's really nice and thin. So, because right now, nothing's agitated, nothing's locked in place. That soap is just kind of acting like a temporary glue, holding everything together. So if you need to adjust something, like a pattern or a piece of a color that maybe moved off where you wanted it to be in the scrubbing, you can actually move it back to where you want it to go. Now that I've spread out the blue, I'm going to roll that pool noodle up and over my wool, put a little bit of pressure in my hands, and do another 2 minutes of rolling. Now, remember, once your 2 minutes are up, you're gonna unroll your kit and then pick your wool up along with your pattern piece and flip it over. And we're gonna do those steps where we wrap the wool around the edge of our pattern piece. And if you have any spot where your piece curves into itself, you're gonna clip into it so that it can wrap around that curve with ease. And that's something else great about needle felting, is that if you run into any problems through our next steps, which are going to be our final agitation steps, if something's not sticking, if something keeps coming off, if you discover a hole that's not supposed to be there, you know, maybe something, the two sides don't really bond together the way they're meant to, needle felting can fix all of those things. So if you run into any issues, of course, feel free to shout out and I will help you out. But if it gets to the point where it's not fixable through wet felting, needle felting fixes all of those things. Now that both sides of our pattern pieces are covered in wool, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get into the real agitation, like the majority of the agitation or the felting that's going to really tangle all those loose wool fibers into like a really nice tight piece of fabric that's going to become three-dimensional. So what we're going to do first, we're going to grab that sheet of plastic out of our soap container and you're going to spread it out flat. So open it up from that ball state into a flat piece. And you're actually going to want to take your felting kit and flip it over so that we're going to be working on the bubbly side of the bubble wrap. So I'm going to pull mine down. So I'm working on the textured side, and you're going to place your felted toy onto that bubbly texture. Now I'm going to take my plastic wrap. I'm going to put it right on top of my creature, like I'm saran wrapping it. And then I'm going to start with one side and I'm going to wrap the plastic around that edge so that there is some plastic covering both the top and the bottom. And the plastic's acting kind of like a protective shield right now. When you have the plastic wrapped around one of the edges, one side of your piece, you're going to take the hand that you don't write with. So I'm taking my left hand and I'm placing it on top of my felted toy to hold it steady. And then my right hand is going to squeeze the edge. And I'm going to, as I'm squeezing it, run my hand up and down the side of my felted creature like this. Now, you can do it where your thumb is on top, 4 fingers are on the bottom. I'll put the edge in between my index finger and my middle finger and kind of bend them and squeeze or straighten them and squeeze. So whatever hand position is more comfortable for you, do it that way. The most important thing is just that you are squeezing while you're running your hand up and down the side. So the reason we're doing this, the point of this step, is to start to felt together those edges that we wrapped around our pattern piece. It's starting to felt together the sides so that we really define the shape of our felted toy. That pattern piece that you cut out, you want it to maintain that shape. So we're going to start by focusing on felting all the sides. So you're going to work on one side for a minute or two, and then you're going to continue by working all of the sides of your pattern piece. So you start with one side and then continue to the next side and the next until you've gone all the way around, and then you're going to flip your piece over and do the exact same thing. So we're doing this action, this teasing, running up and down on all sides of our felted toy. And once you've gone all the way around once, flip it over and do the other side. This step may take a little bit. It may take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to kind of complete the agitation all the way around the outer edge. And if you're wondering, like, how do you know when you're done? Because it might not be just going around each side one whole time. It might not be done after that. So the way that you're going to check to see if you are ready, you finish that step and you're ready for the next one, is by doing something I call the pinch test. So the pinch test is a way to see how tightly the wool fibers have started to felt themselves together. Like how far along in that tangling process have they gotten? So because we've only in the step focused on agitating the outer edges, I'm only going to pinch test the outer edges. I don't want to pinch test in the center of my monster because I haven't done any kind of agitation work really in the center. I've only really been focusing on the outer edges. So take a spot on the outside, take your forefinger and your thumb just to pinch, and you're just going to pinch the fibers. And what you're going to do is pinch the surface and see if you can lift the wool, if you can lift the fibers. Now, I don't know if you can see on the hand cam what that looks like, but you're going to, when you pinch it, you want to see how far you can lift the fibers. And if you're at a point where when you pinch it, the fibers, the wool just pulls right off the surface, like there's no resistance, you just yank it off and it's done, it needs quite a bit more agitation. If you pinch the side, and maybe you can lift the fibers, but you feel some resistance. Right now I'm holding this whole thing up in the air just by pinching some of the fibers. That means that they have started to tangle together just a little bit. Still a little loose, but we're on a good path. It's starting to felt together. So I can lift them still pretty far, even though I'm feeling that resistance, which is a good sign. So I'm going to keep doing my felting of the edges, maybe one more round on each side, and then I'll be ready for that next step. But every once in a while, check your piece with the pinch test to see how your agitation is going. If you keep checking with the pinch test and it's not working and it's not working and the wool is still loose, you might need to apply a little bit more pressure. When you're doing the squeezing, maybe you're applying enough pressure, but not enough movement. You know, if you're really focused on kind of the squeezing, but not the moving back and forth, you know, you got to have both going at once. It could also be an issue where maybe the wool is a little dry. If through the friction of our motion, the wool has started to dry up, you're going to need to squeeze a little bit more soap and water into your piece to keep those scales open so that they can tangle together. As you're doing this step, you might also start to notice a little bit of a visual change. You know, the pinch test is a pretty physical test. You might also start to notice that it looks a little tighter. Like when we did all the folding, right? We wrapped all that excess wool around the edge. Your powder piece may have looked like it lost a little bit of its shape. Maybe it was a little bulky. As it starts to become felted around the edges, the shape might start to look a little bit more defined or a little tighter. You might even notice like a little bit of curving starting to happen because the wool itself is beginning to shrink, and it's beginning to shrink slightly smaller than the pattern piece that is inside our little like felted pillowcase of wool. So that's another good visual way to see that your agitation is working. Now, once you've gotten your edges to be pretty well felted, you've tested that pinch test, you feel resistance, you can begin to agitate the center of your felted toy on both sides. So you can keep your piece on the bubbly texture of your bubble wrap. You can put the plastic back on top, and you can begin to use your fingertips, your knuckles, the heel of your hand, your whole hand to start to kind of press and move in the center of your piece. And you want to do that on both sides. So make sure it's always a combination of pressure and motion at the same time. You don't want to do one without the other. Now, if felting with the plastic sheet on top is not jiving with you, like it's not your favorite thing to do, you don't love the way it feels, you can switch at this point back to the rolling. So I could take my felted toy and I could place it back on the smooth side of my bubble wrap the whole kit up, and begin to roll back and forth. So if agitating with the plastic sheet, you don't like it, it doesn't feel good on your hands, it doesn't feel like you're getting a good grip, once you've done that felting of the outer edges, for the next step where you're working on just agitating the center, you can put it back inside of your kit and do that back and forth rolling, if that felt better for you. If you do go to the rolling or you're agitating with the plastic on top, don't forget to switch sides, to flip it over every once in a while, so both sides are getting equally agitated.
And Mallory, how wet should their felt be right now?
It should be fairly wet. It should be more soapy than it is wet. If you are looking at your piece and it's looking like really, really wet, and you've got maybe like extra water on your mat, but you don't see a lot of soap suds, you might want to actually pick your piece up and bring it over to your soap container, squeeze out. You can actually take this piece, ball it up, and squeeze out some of that excess water, and maybe put a little bit more soap into your soap container, or just a little drop even directly onto your felt if you feel like you are lacking in soap, and then continue to agitate, because again, that soap is super important. Water alone will not felt it, and soap alone will not felt it. You got to have both. But if it seems like, if it feels like you're too sudsy, you can scrape off some of the extra lather that you may be creating back into your soap container and also squeeze it out. And if it feels too watery, squeeze out some of that excess water and just reapply a little bit of soap to balance it out. So I want to show you what you can do next as a almost final form of agitation. Once you've worked on felting the edges with the plastic sheet, and you've also worked on felting the center by using either the plastic sheet or the roller, and you test the center now that we've done some agitating, test it with that pinch test. See if you can lift the fibers. If you can lift them, but you feel resistance, resistance to the point that I'm holding this piece up in the air just by like 2 or 3 wool fibers and it's staying put, that means everything's locking together pretty well. You can start to agitate without the plastic and just your hands. So now that everything's fairly tight, we don't need that protective layer of the plastic to keep the surface of the wool from getting roughed up by just our hands. So I can take my little felted creature, put him in between 2 hands like a woolen hand sandwich, and begin to scrub back and forth like you're washing your hands. And make sure that you're getting every section of your felted toy in between your 2 hands. So my creature is obviously bigger than my 2 hands put together. So I'm gonna have to move my felt around in between my hands so I get every section. Now, the other thing you could do if you don't like the scrubbing between your 2 hands, you can once again go to the bubbly side of your mat, put your felt right onto the surface and actually physically move your felt against the bubbles and scrub it this way. And then flip it over and do the other side. So either of those are awesome ways to finish up the felting and get it to become super, super tight. Both of these actions may cause the wool to dry out faster because the friction of your hands is going to be creating some heat and drying up the water that's inside the wool. So if it starts to feel like it's drying up, don't be afraid to squeeze a little bit more soap and water on there and then keep going with the agitation. Now I'm doing that action to turn my little kind of weird horn things on my creature into something long and pointy. So I'm actually taking it in between my 2 hands and I'm kind of rolling it in between my 2 hands like this. Now, if you're feeling like your creature is getting pretty tightly felted, everything is passing the pinch test, it's looking nice and tight, it's really resembling the pattern piece that you drew. Another thing you can do is a final form of agitation before we cut this open and take out the pattern piece. You can take your piece, make sure it's not too wet or too sudsy, because what you can do is actually take this and you can throw it against your kit. And something about this like really quick impact really felts the wool together quite quickly. So this is always like a final felting step. You can also do this in your sink if you want to make sure that the water and soap doesn't splatter places, but you can do this throwing action to really tightly felt up any of the remaining loose wool pieces. Also, you can just get a lot of frustration out that way, just throw the felt against the mat. Our next step is going to involve cutting our piece open, like I said before, and taking out that pattern piece. And we're going to do a little bit of kind of sculpting with our hands to turn this, which looks kind of 2-dimensional right now, right? It looks like a flat illustration maybe come to life into something more 3D, something that has more body to it. It looks rounder and more like a little stuffed creature of some kind. You have a couple different options as to where you can cut your monster open. You can cut it open at the bottom, especially if your bottom is kind of flat and your creature is going to sit on sort of a flat base. the bottom is a good place to cut it open. You can also cut it open along the side. You know, I have two little legs here, so I don't want to cut it open along the bottom because the opening will be too small and I want to keep those legs intact. So I could also cut it open on a side seam. The other option would be to cut it open in the back, kind of determine what might the back of your toy be. And you can make a little slit right in the middle or kind of off to the side. Imagine like if there was a zipper there or something, like a zipper in the back of a dress or something, you can put a little seam right down the back. Now, wherever you decide to cut it open, what you're going to do is, if you're doing it on an edge, you're going to take your scissors and you're going to put the edge of your felt right to the very back of the scissors, where it's like touching the very, very back, and just make a very, very light bite, like you're making a tiny little cut, just to essentially make an opening to slide this blade of the scissor inside. And then you're going to cut maybe like 3 inches open so that you can get your hand or part of your hand in there. You don't need to cut off, you don't need to like go like this and cut off the bottom. You can actually just make a hole wherever you want your cut to be so that your blade can go inside your felted creature and you can snip. So for me, I'm gonna do my little slit on the back of my monster, kind of off to the side. So I'm gonna use the blade of my scissor to just make a little hole in the felt. So now I've slipped my scissor blade inside, and I'm gonna snip, snip, and snip. And you can see now I've got a little opening in my felt. And through that opening, I can grab the pattern piece and pull it out, because the pattern piece doesn't need to be in there anymore. What it was doing was keeping the two sides of our felt from felting together, so we can have two sides that make essentially like a little felted pillowcase, and also giving us the shape. But now that I have this opening, I can pull the pattern piece out and I can start to shape this a little bit before we put the stuffing in. So like I was saying before, right now it looks pretty flat, right? Looks two-dimensional, like a cartoon character just kind of came off the paper and came to life. I want this to be 3D. I want it to have like a body and take up space. So I'm gonna take my hand and get it inside the opening of my little creature and kind of open my hand up, palm up, against these sharp edges. So I'm kind of pulling that open, putting my hand inside, and then again doing that scrubbing action to start to turn that edge into something not flat but open. So I can do that on the other side as well. To see, once again, this is like that sharp edge that I'm talking about. We want that to open up. So I'm going to put my palm in there so it opens up, and then I start to scrub. And it starts to become a little bit more rounded, right? It looks a little bit more puffy. So you're just trying to open your creature up a little bit so it's not so flat. If you're having trouble with this step, that's okay. We're gonna, most of the body is going to come from the stuffing that we're actually gonna be putting inside of our felted creatures. So inside your kit, there was a bag of white fluff, and that is fiber fill, and we're gonna be using that to stuff our felted creatures. Like pillow stuffing or stuffed animal stuffing, basically, is what that is. Now, if your felted creature is at a point where you are happy with it, it feels tight, you like the shape of it, you're done with the felting, the next step is going to be to take this piece, take it to a sink and rinse it out. You want to rinse out all that soap so that you don't have like an oily felted toy. So you're going to take it to a sink. You can actually ball it up Don't be afraid to ball it up and really squeeze until all of the soap comes out. You can use warm or hot water so that it continues to felt in the rinsing process. And then you're gonna wanna make sure that you dry it out as best as you can. So that can either be through squeezing it dry in a dry towel. You can use a hair dryer to dry it out, or you can even throw it in a dryer if you have that available and put it on high for like maybe 2 minutes to get out all the moisture. Any one of those methods will work just fine. You just want to make sure it's as dry as possible for the needle felting. So I'm going to go rinse my piece out and begin to dry it. And you guys, if you're ready, can do the same. And once you have your piece dried out, it's as dry as possible. What you can do is actually put your felting kit off to the side. So the pool noodle and the bubble wrap, the plastic and the soap container, the mesh, all of that can be placed off to the side because our next steps, the next thing we're going to learn is needle felting. And that is a dry form of felting where we're going to be using that styrofoam block and the little needles that should be wrapped up in tape. That's what you're going to need next from your kit for our next steps. So everything else can kind of go off to the side. Just have your stuffing nearby, have your needle felting needles, your styrofoam block, and the wool, whatever wool is left. You still want to have that on hand. Now, if you have finished drying out your monster, what you can do while we're waiting, I don't want to get into needle felting until everybody's ready, but if your monster's totally dry, you're ready to go, you can take that white stuffing that came inside your kit and you can begin to fill your felted toy up with that stuffing. So you don't want to fill it to the point where it's, overstuffed and overflowing, but you do want it to be fairly full. So stop short of having it so tightly stuffed that the stuffing is like popping out of the opening and you can't possibly close the seam, but you don't want it to have it so lightly stuffed that it doesn't really take on a 3D form. So somewhere in between there is the sweet spot. So needle felting, like I said before, we're using the styrofoam block that came inside your kit, as well as the needles that might be covered in a little bit of tape right now so that they don't poke you, because these are sharp tools. So we're going to be very careful when we use them. Now, if you take the tape off of your needle felting needle and look at it really closely, you might notice that the skinny point, the very top of the needle, has these little notches that's cut into it if you look really close. And what those notches are doing is they're doing the tangling action. So when we were wet felting, we were tangling the fibers together using a funky scientific property of wool with those little scales that open up when they get wet. Now the needle felting needle doesn't require the wool to be wet because it doesn't need the scales on the wool fibers to be open, because these little notches that are cut into the tip of the needle are tangling the fibers together. So we can actually connect our wool fibers to the fiber fill fibers that's inside the monster, even though one is made out of plastic and one is coming from a sheep. So needle felting, the way I hold my tool is with my middle and forefinger behind the needle, kind of at the top. That's the handle, the thicker part of the needles where you hold on, and then your thumb is going in the middle. So that's kind of what my hand looks like in the hand cam. 2 fingers behind, thumb on top, doing a little pinch. Now, the way that you want to move the needle is really just an up and down motion into whatever you are needle felting. And you want to hinge from your wrist. So you don't want to use your whole arm to move or be hinging from your elbow. I like to rest my elbow on the table and just leave my wrist free so that my wrist can move and move the needle up and down, up and down. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is close up the seam, right? We want to close up that opening where we stuffed our creature. So I'm going to put the creature on top of my foam block, because that's our work surface. And we're going to kind of push the opening closed. You see that? I'm taking my fingers on either side and I'm kind of pushing it closed and stuffing the stuffing back in there until the two sides of the opening touch. Now, once I've got it in that position, I'm going to take my needle and very carefully, because my hands are near where I'm going to be poking, I'm going to begin to poke in and out on that seam, on that line where I'm trying to get it to stay put. So you want to keep squeezing it so that it's in the correct position as you're needle felting it, but very carefully to watch your fingers. And you're trying to tangle the wool fibers together with the polyester fibers that is making up the stuffing to get everything to stay put. Now, you know, this is kind of like sewing without thread is the way I think of it. With sewing, one stitch can cover a very large area. Look at your needle and see how thin the tip of that needle is. Every time you go in and out with your needle, you're only tangling a very small area of the fibers. So you might need to go in and out, in and out, in and out in the same spot multiple times before you really get everything to stay in place. So you can see the action of my hand, how many times I'm going in and out of one section. Don't feel like you need to go crazy fast. You know, there's not like a speed that you need to be going at. It's whatever is most comfortable for you. And remember with the needle that it's only like the top 1 inch of the needle that's doing any of the tangling property or any of the tangling action. So if you're needle felting and you're putting your needle like way deep into your monster to the point where the handle, like the top bar of the needle is almost touching, that means that the part that's doing the tangling is like way down in your foam. So you're not really needle felting the spot that you're trying to needle felt. If you can see on the hand cam, the way that my needle, it's just the tip that's going in. It's not the whole needle, it's just the top part where those little notches are cut in. So if you feel like you're needle felting and it's not working, you might be going too deep with the needle. It might also be that there is moisture still left in the wool. So if you are needle felting, you're making sure it's only the tip that's going in and it's still not holding tight. It might be that your wool is still a little damp. So just give it some more squeezes with the towel or hit it with the hair dryer again to make sure all the moisture is gone. Now, another way you can close up this opening if you're having trouble getting the seam to really stay put, and this goes for any kind of hole that you might have. If you discovered you had a thin spot or a hole where there's some fiberfill poking through and you want to patch it up, you can take some fresh roving unfelted wool, and I can again tear a small piece and place it on top of the hole that I want to patch and build up a few layers, just like before, right on top of that hole. Hold it in place with my fingers spread far apart so they're far away from where my needle's gonna go. And I can begin to needle felt the wool, the unfelted wool, right into that hole to patch it up. And I wanna make sure I'm really going over the whole surface. So that everything gets well attached and well connected. You can layer up the colors just like you did with the wet felting. So I'm going to put a little bit of the lighter gray on top of that dark gray that I had on there. And then I'll probably put like maybe a little blue on top as well. So right now, just focus on trying to close up your seams and also patch up any holes that you noticed that you want to close up. And then I'll get into making decorations, making eyes and faces and little hands and feet and horns and teeth and whatever else you might want to add to your felted toy. Okay, so now I have that opening kind of patched up. Can't see the stuffing anymore. And that's going to be the face of my little creature. Now, something else nifty you can do with needle felting is you can actually start to change the shape of your toy. So I have these little feet guys at the bottom of my creature. If I want the base to be really nice and flat, if they're feeling a little round, I can actually use my needle to needle felt kind of a round circle on the foot, and it's going to flatten out the bottom of the foot. It's going to make like a little flat circular base just by poking and kind of flattening out the wool and the fiber fill that's making up the foot right now. So just by doing a little bit of needle felting, I don't know if it's possible to see that on the camera. So I've gone from more of like a rounded bottom to more of a flat bottom that it can really stand on. You can use your needle to sort of change the shape of your felted toy by deciding what you might want to be flat or what you might want to be more indented somewhere, and using your needle to poke that into place. So if I want the indent in between the 2 feet to be a little bit more defined, I can use my needle to kind of poke that space back into the monster or my creature or whatever it is I'm making, and define that indent just a little bit more. So I can show you a really good example actually of that idea. This little felted pumpkin here, when I wet felted it, it was just a smooth, round pumpkin shape. But to get these, you guys can see like the little indents, you know, pumpkins have these kind of like little ribs almost that make them up. All of that shaping, all this line work that's making it look like a pumpkin, I did through needle felting. So I used my needle to create those indented lines by doing this, by poking a curvy line into the side and making the wool and the fiber fill kind of come tightly together along that line. And then I get a nice little indent. So you can really do a lot of shaping with the needle. Okay, so for your eyes, really they can be any color you want. I'm gonna go with white first, and then I'll show you how you can throw on a little iris, so the colored part of your eye, as well as the pupil, the black part, and then little highlights. Now, you don't have to make your eye this way. You can make it all one color, like my little ghostly pumpkin obviously just has white eyes. You could do it that way. You could do your eyes as all black with just a couple little white dots for a highlight, and that can look awesome. Like this guy here, he just has a one black eye with little white dots. So you can do it either of those ways, but I'm going to show you how to do it so it has an iris and a pupil and highlights, and then you can, you know, edit it any way you choose. So the first step to your eyeball is going to be taking a piece of wool. Again, my base is going to be white, so I'm going to start with white, and you're going to fold the top of the wool over itself, and then fold it again, and fold it again, and fold it again. So you're kind of wrapping up like this little like woolen pillow, essentially. Now, that looks a little bit big for my monster, so I'm going to fold it in half another time. So again, just like with our wet felting, we're creating layers of wool. So I can actually take this little pillow, place it directly onto my monster wherever I want it to go, hold it in place with 2 fingers. I'm holding my fingers as far apart as they can be so that they're nowhere near my needle. And I'm gonna start by needle felting just the center of the little pillow, just the middle, in between my 2 fingers so that it stays put. Now that it's attached, I can remove my other hand and get it out of the needle's way. Now that looks nothing like an eye, right? There's all this like weird loose fluff sticking out. I'm gonna use my needle felting needle to take that extra fluff, drag it in where I want it to go, and then poke. Drag it in, poke. See this like long tuft? I don't want that there. I'm gonna kind of wrap my needle around it, drag it into place, and poke. So you can use your needle to kind of draw the shape that you want by dragging the wool where you want it to go and then poking it to keep it locked in place. Once I've gotten it to be a good shape, I'll use my needle to go across the surface, flatten it out, and I want to keep needle felting until there's no more fluff. I want it to be pretty cohesive, pretty flat, and look like it's a part of my little felted toy. That's also going to make sure that it's like really strongly attached. The more my needle goes in and out over the surface, the more I'm really attaching that white wool to my felted toy and making sure it's locked in place. All right, so that's the base of my eyeball. So if you would like, you can also do something where you outline your eyeball. So right now it's just a white ball. If I want to outline this to kind of define it, give it some definition or some contrast, I can use black or another color. Maybe I actually want to use some black mixed with some blue. So I'll take a really thin piece of black, like this, very nice and thin. And I'll take a really thin piece of blue and I'll put them together. So I'm holding them both together and I'm going to twist the ends in opposite directions. So I'm holding both pieces together and then I'm rolling them between my fingers in opposite directions. So it's almost like I'm twisting up a piece of yarn. And you can then use this, you kind of just created like a woolen line. You can use this to lay on the outside of your eyeball and poke it into place, holding it down with your fingers while you do that first set of poking, and then use that needle to drag the line around the eyeball and poke it into place. You could also use that technique of making a line to make like trees or make words or make eyebrows or, you know, eyelashes on your creature. Use it to outline a mouth or a nose. So you're taking a thin piece of wool and then twisting it in opposite directions, either end in opposite directions to make a woolly piece of yarn. You could also use yarn. If you have yarn on hand, you can use yarn to kind of create some needle felted elements to your creature. If you want to use it to outline the eye or make eyebrows or eyelashes, you can actually attach little pieces of yarn. So now my eye looks a little bit more defined, right? Because it has that dark line around the outside. If you want to then put an iris in your eyeball, make my iris blue, I'm going to take a very small piece of wool super, super small. And I'm gonna roll it between my thumb and my fingers to kind of tangle it up. And I've just gotten like a little tangled ball of blue wool. I'm gonna place that onto my eye. And then again, needle felt it in the center so it stays put, and then go across the surface to flatten it out. Now, there's your iris. If you want to mix multiple colors together for your iris, you can take a small piece of, a small piece of green and a small piece of yellow and a small piece of white. You could, blend a couple different colors together. Just make sure it's really small pieces of wool. If you then want to put a pupil into that iris, you can again take an even tinier piece of black wool, roll it between your fingers, place it onto the iris, whatever color it is, and again, poke it into place. So you're like stacking all these different little circles on top of each other. A white circle first, and then blue circle on top of that, black on top of that. And then if you want to do a highlight, because eyeballs, they are wet, so they reflect light. And we're generally always looking at some light source. So everyone, if you looked really closely at somebody next to you, like really closely in their eyes, you would see little dots of light reflected in their eyeballs. So in order to mimic that, we can take the tiniest bit of white and again, roll it between our fingers to make a tiny white dot that you can place in your pupil or almost in between the pupil and the iris, and then poke that into place. You have the white part of the eye, the outline, iris, pupil, highlight. Now I kind of want this guy to just have, I think I want to give him one white eye and one black eye that has just the highlight. So the other one I'll make would be just a black eye with little white dots in it. So it'll look sort of like this guy here. Now this one, the swirl that's on top of this little creature was done through needle felting. So I did that same method of outlining the eye where I took a long thin piece of roving like this and I twisted it. I twisted it in opposite directions on either end. So I got like a little piece of yarn and then I held it in place to get it started. And then I needle felted it down. And then I continued to use my needle to move that little piece of wool where I wanted it to go. Every time I moved it, I poked it into place. And then I created that swirl. So this is all done through needle felting. You can make your swirl through needle felting or through wet felting or both. I could make a darker blue little curvy line and kind of outline the swirl that's on here to give it some definition. So many things you can do. So that's the eyeball. I'll show you how you can make like an addition to your little creature that can be, doesn't have to be flat. It doesn't have to be attached fully to the little monster. Like if you wanted to make ears or hands or feet or something that's attached, but kind of freestanding. So it can kind of move like little ears or little hands or wings of some kind. What you would do is you would actually start to needle felt that on the block and not directly onto your creature. So let's say I wanted to make little like feet to stick out from the bottom of my little guy. So maybe I'll take some of this gray wool, some of this darker brown wool together. And I'll take this and I'm going to, again, just like the eyeball, fold the top over and then fold it over again, fold it over again, and again, and again, until I have essentially this little woolen pillow, just like the eyeball. And I'm going to put that onto my felting block this time, onto that block of styrofoam, and use my needle to start to flatten it. I want to needle felt all of those folded layers together into one flat item. And it's gonna look right now like just kind of a weird blobby square. In order to change the shape, I can use my needle to sort of drag the corners in to make it more curvy, drag the corner in, and then poke it once it's in place. Keep going over the surface. And then I'm gonna peel it off the block, flip it over, and then felt the other side. You wanna make sure you felt both sides to make it nice and strong. Now, right now, I've got this kind of funky little foot. Maybe I want this darker part of the foot to become little toes. So I could take my scissors and I could clip into my little felted foot to separate 3 little toes like that. So now I have like a little monster foot. And you could then put that back on your block once it's cut and continue to needle felt across the surface to make sure everything is nice and tightly felted. And it's not going to fall apart. And once again, you can flip it over. You want to repeat that a few times where you're needle felting one side, peel it up, flip it over, needle felt the other side. That's going to give you a really strong, tightly felted ear or foot or whatever it is you might be making. So now I have this kind of little monster foot with the 3 little toes. So I can take that wherever I want it to go on my felted toy, you know, whether it's a nose or an ear, wherever you want it to attach, hold it in place. So if I'm putting it on my foot, I'm putting it down here. And wherever my felted toy and the new piece that I've just made, wherever they're touching, that's where you're needle felting. That's where you want the needle to tangle those fibers together to get them to attach to each other. So imagine wherever you would glue something together or sew something together, that's where the needle should be poking. And you can use that method of needle felting something on the block and attaching it for all sorts of different things: hands, wings, feet, noses, you know, whatever you might want it to be. And now I have a little foot kind of sticking off the front. And I could make another one, and then he has 2 little feet. Right now he's just got the one. So that's how you make a separate piece that's pretty flat. If you want it to be more 3D, this will be like kind of like the last thing that I demo through needle felting, unless anyone has any specific requests that they'd like to see how to do. What you can do is, once again, we'll start with a piece of wool, and we'll start by, once again, folding the top over continuously until you have this little like woolen pillow that looks like this. And then I'm actually going to take this little pillow and fold it and kind of roll it up into a little log, right? So now I have this little like woolen tube. And then I'll put that on my felting block, and I'll needle felt the folded side together. So I'm trying to keep that in place, trapping all that wool into this tiny little log shape. Right, and now it's kind of stuck to my felting block. And then I'm just gonna push it over slightly and then needle felt that exact same side. I'm not going across the top because I don't want to flatten it out. I'm only kind of needle felting the edge. And then I'll peel it off, roll it over a little bit more, needle felt that same edge. And keep repeating that where you keep rolling it and keep needle felting that edge. And you'll start to get a little, something that might look like a claw or an arm or a really big tooth, or maybe it's a horn. You know, if I wanted to take this and maybe attach it to the front of this guy, so it starts to look like maybe he has a second set of horns along with his really long spiky ears. I could put it there. I could put it at the foot to give him little clawed feet. I could put it here and he starts to have like a little arm. Maybe it's here and that becomes its nose, like a little beak of some kind, you know, so this shape, you can use it for a lot of different things. Does anyone have any questions about those steps, those techniques? Anything about needle felting, anything you want to see a second time or a third time? So I think that, you know, the wet felting takes a lot of steps that aren't intuitive. You know, you wouldn't necessarily like think to yourself, yes, I need 5 crisscrossing layers of wool and water and soap to make the felt. But I always think that the needle felting, once you see the poking action makes the wool stick together, it becomes a lot more intuitive. You can kind of start making up your own methods of how to build something, how to make a shape. You really just need a thickness of wool, you know, to make something thick or make something big. And then you just kind of fold it up and start to use the needle to shape it. So I always like seeing what people come up with at this part of the workshop when they start decorating. Something else fun you can do is if you wanted to add hair or something fuzzy like fur to your toy, you can take some loose roving and you can just start to attach it to your toy by just needle felting across the top. So I'm not going to needle felt across the whole surface. I'm just going to go across the top of the little piece of roving to get it to stick to my toy and leave the rest of it loose and fluffy. And look, now he has a beard, like a Dumbledore beard. Or you could trim it and put a bunch of that on and it becomes fur, or you put it on the head and it becomes really funky hair. You know, I've even had students who they'll take a couple pieces of roving and they'll braid it together and then needle felt that braid onto their little felted monster or whatever it is they're making. So there's lots of options.